Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Dixon, and welcome back to The Shattering Place, the podcast that explodes the myth of materialism, exploring the living science and true stories of multidimensionality in service to healing, awakening, and the evolution of consciousness. In our first episode, episode 1, The Crack in the Vessel, Outgrowing the Myth of Materialism, we traced the fracture in materialism through science, history, and consciousness itself, and glimpsed how that shattering might be the beginning of a new paradigm. If you haven't yet listened to episode 1, I invite you to start there. In episode 2, we explored the terrain of the body as a portal, a storyteller, as a bridge between timelines. Each episode builds on the last. Together, they form a living map of multidimensional healing and transformation. Today, we continue the journey with episode 3, The Collective Broadcast, Beyond the Myth of the Isolated Mind. In a materialist world, privacy is our protection. We can hide our shadows, our traumas, and our deepest longings. We see the other as the other, and we can even perceive others' problems as not our own in politics, in health, economics, spirituality. But in a multidimensional reality, the self-other boundary is porous. The telepathy tapes show us that we're already living in a shared mental landscape. A bit more on that in a moment. This is all a modern articulation of an ancient human intuition. We've always sensed a shared layer of reality that surrounds us like air. The Greeks called it the nous, the cosmic mind that organizes the universe. Jung famously mapped it as the collective unconscious, a reservoir of archetypes and memories shared by all of humanity. In our era, this theory is explored with compelling proof in the documentary series The Telepathy Tapes by creator Kai Dickens. You've probably heard of it. Kai Dickens investigates cases of non-speaking autistic children who communicate telepathically. The evidence centers on the children's ability to read specific information. For example, long strings of numbers, obscure words, secret phrases, reading them from the minds of their facilitators without physical cues. In controlled tests, these children replicate complex data held in another person's active thoughts. These findings challenge the broken label often placed on the nonverbal. Instead of a deficit, these children are seen to possess an unfiltered access to a shared field of consciousness. The accuracy of these telepathic hits skyrockets when the adult enters into a state of focused and calm intention, revealing perhaps a biological bridge that materialism has yet to acknowledge, something I refer to as resonance in my visionary fiction. This bridge is now being measured in real time, moving beyond individual instances of this telepathic ability and into the collective field. Now, to understand this, we have to look at how we measure the invisible influence of our thoughts. Since the late 1990s, the Global Consciousness Project has maintained a network of random number generators, often called black boxes, all over the world. These are small electronic devices designed to produce a completely unpredictable stream of zeros and ones. Now, under normal circumstances, the output is pure noise, like a coin flip that always stays at 50-50. However, when a massive global event occurs that draws the focus of millions of people, these machines suddenly stop being random. They begin to order themselves in particular ways, as if the collective attention of humanity is physically pressing on the circuitry. So, peer-reviewed research published in January 2026, very recently, by Dr. Joe Dispenza and the Heart Maths Institute together, confirms this shared field through this very technology. During Dispenza's coherence healing sessions, random number generators distributed globally suddenly synchronized, responding, as it were, as the argument is, to the collective emotional coherence of the group. This data suggests that even a small, highly coherent collective group generates a measurable field of influence capable of organizing physical reality. The HeartMath Institute's research into heart coherence does show, and has for a long time now, that the heart is the most powerful generator of electromagnetic energy in the human body, radiating several feet away from the human body in a toroidal field. Crucially, they've proven that we are literally tuning into each other's biology through the air. I really encourage everyone to visit, and I'll link below in my show notes, the HeartMath Institute, to look at their experiments in greater depth than I can articulate in our podcast episode. Now, the primary conductor of this tuning just might be water. There's a researcher called Veda Austin, and she has studied the crystallographic language of water. And she proposes that water is a living, sentient fluid capable of receiving and storing information. Now, I realize this sounds far out. Some of you might have heard of Dr. Masaru Emoto's famous book, The Secret Life of Water, in which he reveals how thought affects water. He has some beautiful photographs of what the crystals look like under a microscope when certain thoughts are directed at them. Austin continues this work with multiple controlled experiments showing how water responds to human thought and intention by freezing into recognizable ice crystals that mirror the stimulus. And again, I'll link her work below. I really encourage everyone to have a look. One of the things she has found is that if you put the seed of something into the water and freeze it, the pattern of the frozen pattern actually reveals the inevitable full growth of the adult, fully grown version of that. So if you put a seed from an apple, it will freeze in the pattern of an apple, a fully formed apple. It's quite fascinating research. And, again, we want to live deeply in these questions, but I do encourage everyone to check this material out for themselves. In any case, because the human body is composed mostly of water, her findings do imply that our internal oceans, as it were, are constantly being imprinted by the collective broadcast. Water is the bridge that carries information from the implicate order into physical form. And to that, I will add that we have discovered something called the interstitium, which is a connected body of water in the fascia of the human body. And it is theorized that this is how we hold on to past trauma, is in the interstitium, in the water which is held in the human body. In any case, moving on, to understand how information like this moves through the field, we really have to look at the work of Rupert Sheldrake. A lot of you might have heard of him. As a Cambridge-trained biologist, Sheldrake became fascinated by how biological systems, from a growing embryo to a flock of birds, know how to take their specific shape without a central command. This led him to coin the term morphic resonance. It's derived from the Greek word morphe, which means form. Essentially, it's the idea that the form of things is drawn from a collective memory. He suggests that every time a member of a species learns a new behavior or a cell takes a certain shape, it creates a resonance that makes it easier for the next one to do exactly the same thing. If our hearts are the transmitters and our cellular waters form a receiver, then morphic resonance is the program being run. The field, as it were, acts as a collective library almost. Every breakthrough we make, every lesson we integrate contributes to a reservoir of human capacity that belongs to us all. Now, Sheldrake remains a controversial figure in the establishment. Yet, he's part of a growing movement of scientists who are actively dismantling the status quo. Much of modern science provides a framework for understanding how these phenomena are possible, even without naming telepathy directly. For instance, the physicist David Bohm proposed the implicate order, suggesting that at a quantum level, everything is enfolded into everything else. In this model, there is no here and there, only a single unbroken wholeness. In an unbroken wholeness, the notion of private thoughts is an absurdity. Our minds are simply local nodes of a singular broadcast, and we have always lived in this mist, this nous, as it was called in ancient Greece, and we're finally developing the instruments to prove that it exists. So, building on this understanding of the implicate order, as David Bohm referred to it, my therapeutic practice has consistently confirmed that selfhood itself is porous, meaning it's not a singular, hard membrane separating an individual from the world around us. Over nearly 15 years in this context, in the therapy room, I have lived the reality of this shared field. These experiences arrived early in my career when I primarily focused on body work for trauma release. So, modalities like de-armoring, including myofascial release, including different forms of energy healing. That was how I got my start before I did more conventional therapy training. Operating on the fringes of conventional practice enabled me to hone the skill of feeling what occurs at a nonverbal level. I want to, however, normalize this phenomenon. If you speak to anyone who works deeply with the human form, the human body, so massage therapists, chiropractors, any kind of somatic healer, you will find that after working with enough bodies, perception expands naturally beyond the cognitive baseline. So you stop relying solely on verbal input. Frequently, for example, for me, I would sense heat in a specific area only for the client to confirm a chronic injury or illness in that exact spot. Other times, I would perceive a specific image, like an elderly woman, and the client would reveal that they were focused on their grandmother or memories of their grandmother at that very moment. The examples I could give you are endless. My experience is that the boundaries between one psyche and another are not defined by the membranes of human tissue. In season 2, we will examine these case studies in greater depth. In that season, I will be joined by thinkers and practitioners working at the edges of the known to bring these concepts into art, into sciences, into everything. But for now, we are looking at the reality of receiving the broadcasts of the other, literally hosting their thoughts and images within your own psyche. This landscape extends into our domestic lives as well. My favorite example involves the adoption of our first cat when my daughter was 10. So she had decided she wanted a cat that simply needed a home, regardless of the age. One night, we both had a dream. In my dream, we had found a 3-month-old female calico cat. And the next morning, before I could share with my daughter a single detail of this dream, she came running to me and very excited to tell me that she'd had her own dream. She had dreamt that we had a 3-month-old calico cat that belonged to us. The sequence that followed confirmed a larger organization of the field. It deepens the mystery because later that day, or it was a couple days later, I took our family dog to the vet. Out of the blue, the vet asked if I happened to be looking for a new pet. I told him that we were, and I remember thinking to myself, I'll just say it. I told him jokingly with a laugh, yes, we're looking for a 3-month-old female calico. His eyes widened. He had recently rescued a kitten who'd been abandoned behind a supermarket, and she matched that exact description. We took her home. She'd had all of her, she'd had all of her shots. She'd been desexed. She was 3 months old by then. And we took her home, and Nisha has been with us ever since. That was 10 years ago. I'm sure that you can feel that if you go beyond the wow factor, the implications of that story are quite staggering because the story speaks to a flow of information from the cat to me, to my daughter, to the vet, and it's almost like there was a coordination with logic or intention that transcends linear time. It suggests a field where privacy is an illusion and information moves freely according to a higher coherence. And it even suggests that there's something larger directing it. We really are living in a broadcast where everything is already known and everything is already connected. Now, in psychotherapy, we are trying to see this shared space through the lens of intersubjectivity. We talk about the third area, that field created when two people sit together, where thoughts and feelings aren't just mine or yours, but they become ours. The psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion took this further with his concept of the container and the contained. He proposed that a therapist actually digests the raw, unmanageable psychic data of the client, that we literally take in the projections of another, process them in our own bodies, and hand them back in a form that can be integrated. Maybe with a beautifully articulated truth, or a singular word, or a deep resonant sigh, for example. But here is the truth. The field exists anyway, as all of my previous examples have showed. Sometimes we can learn to receive that broadcast better, and it's for another episode to explore how, since obviously in today's era, such a skill is considered special and not commonplace. It doesn't mean, though, that it's not happening. So perhaps when we drop into the body with intention and focus and with practice over time, as happens to me when I do body work and even therapy sessions, perhaps the static of the ego, of the personality, of our noisy thoughts does clear. And perhaps when that noise dies down, we begin to receive the broadcast of the other as a clear signal. And perhaps the loss of privacy that's implied here, maybe that feels like a crisis to the ego, which is why we have to drop kind of beyond the ego. But perhaps it feels like a homecoming to the soul. In fact, telepathy might be a baseline biological function we are only just beginning to tap into, even for those of us who aren't autistic. And I think the Telepathy Tapes makes that suggestion, and I think there's a lot of evidence. And if you haven't listened to that, you must go do it. There are quite a few really out there, seemingly educational programs like the Art of Living intuition process, the Midbrain activation program, and various what they call blindfold sight workshops, where they teach children how to perceive visual data without the use of their physical eyes. So they are blindfolded. There's a lot of that in my show notes for you to check out on your own. But in any case, I'm just going to continue with this argument that it may well be the case that we are witnessing a latent biological capacity. That, when you get children who are very young, they can easily learn to do this. Perhaps it is a remnant of a sensory system that materialism, because paradigms affect us, as I spoke about in my last episode, the materialism has taught us to ignore. However, formal peer-reviewed clinical studies on this blindfolded sight experience are yet to be forthcoming. So we have to look at living evidence instead. We have to actually see for ourselves and make our own determinations. As shown in the film Superhuman, The Invisible Made Visible, again linked in the show notes, we can see children and adults navigating obstacle courses, reading books, and identifying colors whilst completely blindfolded. So this is presented as a trainable skill of the human nervous system. And if these schools and footage in Superhuman, the documentary, if they're capturing a real phenomenon, it suggests that the body is capable of sensing the field directly. And it implies that our private experience of reality is actually a filtered down version of a much wider, more transparent glass mind, as I call it, that is always available to us if only we know, if only we learn how to tune the dial. We see the mechanics of this tuning in the work of Lynn McTaggart and her meditation experiments, again in the show notes. In her experiments, groups of people focus on a single intention, and doing so actually alters the physical properties of water, the growth rates of seeds, for example, all from a distance. We also see it in Rupert Sheldrake's work on the sense of being stared at, again linked in the show notes, which proves that our attention has a physical reach. Even the Heart Math Institute has shown that our heart's electromagnetic field communicates with the nervous systems of everyone in our vicinity. This is mirrored in our brain's mirror neurons, which fire when we observe another's actions, so as if we are performing them ourselves. What this means is that if we are watching someone do something like, say, ride a bicycle, our brain fires in exactly the same way as if we ourselves were riding a bicycle. This is neurobiology, and this mirroring effect is the domain of neurobiology. And mirror neurons show us something really important. They offer us a structural evidence that our nervous systems were designed to be porous. Our nervous systems were designed to be interfaces for collective resonance rather than just closed loops of individual data. We each have a really tangible effect on each other, even in our brain waves and our neurons. Even the Heart Math Institute has shown that our heart's electromagnetic field communicates with the nervous systems of everyone in our vicinity. What does this mean for this idea that we are separate selves? All of this is actually pointing to something many of you will be familiar with called non-duality, which is the lived experience of oneness. Non-duality is the realization or experience that the separate self is a mental construct, that our true nature is that of a single, all-inclusive organism. The other is a byproduct of a temporary lens, a specific perspective that obscures the reality of shared experience. Non-duality has been the purview of ancient thought for millennia, forming the bedrock of traditions like Advaita Vedanta in India, Taoism in China, and Zen Buddhism, for example. These lineages, these contemplative traditions, describe a fundamental reality, often called Brahman or the Tao or emptiness. In any case, a state where the distinction between the observer and the observed disappears. The drop of water is the ocean. The ocean is the drop. For the ancients, this was a direct realization achieved through the systematic stripping away of ego filters. This perspective has a physical counterpart in the brain. Many of you might also have heard of something called the default mode network. The default mode network is the neurological home of the ego being I, me, my experience, my personality. And this network is responsible for self-referential thought, ruminating on the past, maintaining a me narrative. It acts as a filter narrowing the vastness of the multidimensional field into a manageable, isolated identity. Active default mode network states sustain the illusion of separation, that there is a me and there is a you. The most dramatic evidence of this appears through the use of certain plant medicines and psychedelics. Research in this area shows that substances like psilocybin and ayahuasca specifically target and decouple the default mode network. By temporarily offlining this ego architect, these medicines remove the filter. The result, experientially, is a profound ego dissolution, where the brain's individual nodes communicate with a freedom and global connectivity that is usually suppressed. The medicine reveals the experience of oneness by removing the neurological barrier that prevents our perception of it in the first place. When the default mode network is quieted, the biological reality of our unfoldment is revealed. finally, we have to look at the extraterrestrial phenomena. If we listen to high-level whistleblowers and testimonials from people like David Grush or Colonel Neal, or even the deep dive research of Dr. Gary Nolan at Stanford, I will link everything in the show notes. If we listen to these whistleblowers, there is a consistent theme that emerges, and that is that advanced intelligence doesn't use verbal language. So I encourage everyone to do your own research and make up your own mind about this, because it's quite extraordinary information when you really start to listen to what all of these different people over time are sharing. Testimonials from those who claim to have interacted with these others, these non-human beings, describe a consciousness assisted technology, even. They describe ships that are piloted by thought, where the craft and the pilot are a single telepathic circuit. These species appear to have evolved beyond the need for the private mind in the first place. They live as a more coordinated species, and I'm sure there are many of you who are also thinking of Star Trek, right? But in any case, these reports are showing us that telepathy isn't a superpower. Perhaps it is a standard operating system for any species that survives its own technological adolescence. When we look at others piloting ships with their minds, or children reading words through their blindfolds, it's easy to feel like we're talking about some distant, unreachable future, right? But we have to realize that the technology that's being used in this case, it's not made of metals and wires. It's technology. It's the technology of consciousness, right? And that same hardware already exists here. It's humming beneath our skin, as it were. Here's the thing. The shift from a private mind to a glass mind implies something just far more profound than just shared thoughts. It suggests that we might be operating within a shared nervous system of a sort, right? Now, in a materialist framework, we're taught that our nerves end when our skin meets the air. But if we look at the body as an electromagnetic interface, and refer here to episode 2, we see that our nervous systems are actually broadcast systems. We're constantly reading the room because our autonomic states, our calm, our hypervigilance, our grief, all of our states vibrate outward and are picked up by the nervous systems of those around us. We've already discussed some of the research around this, Heart Mass Institute, mirror neurons. When we speak of what I call the glass mind, we are acknowledging that our internal biological states are not contained. They are transparent. We are essentially a single vast neural network, constantly regulating and imprinting upon one another through the field. Every time you walk into a room and sense unspoken tension, or you find yourself finishing the sentence of someone else, you are experiencing the collapse of the private mind. You are witnessing the truth that our thoughts are not barricaded within the skull. We are constantly participating in an invisible shared dialogue where the nervous system of one becomes the environment for the other. The data from the therapy room, the lab, and even the stars all lead to the same inescapable conclusion. We are, as a species, an interconnected nervous system. This leads us to what I call the ethics of resonance. Ethics is traditionally the study of how we choose to exist in relationship to others. It's like the code of conduct that governs our participation in a shared world. In a materialist paradigm, ethics is largely about external actions, right? What we do with our hands or with our tongues, how we interact with each other, what we share or don't share. However, in a multidimensional reality, ethics extends into the landscape of our very thoughts. If our minds are porous, we have a new responsibility. Our internal state is a public broadcast. The data from the Telepathy Tapes and the Heart Mass Institute suggests that our private frequencies are actually environmental inputs from everyone around us. We are constantly imprinting the collective quote-unquote water of the field with our resonance. This is the heart of the matter, since thoughts are broadcast into the collective field, inner work then becomes a planetary responsibility. Every time we move from reactive chaos into a state of coherence, we are literally cleaning the shared air. We are being invited to trade the illusion of isolated safety for the power of coherent connection. If we are no longer islands, we are a single continent in the making. This new human architecture looks like a community of nodes where the individual healing contributes to the stability of the whole. It looks like a world where we take as much care with our internal broadcast as we do with our external speech. We are building a reality where the privacy of our despair is being replaced by the potency of our shared awakening. When we ask what this actually looks like in practice, we can find a clue in the osteopathic tradition of biodynamic cranial touch or stillness touch, something I have been practicing in my work for a long time. In this space, the field is often called the long tide. Practitioner Charles Ridley describes how this field appears on its own with its own spontaneous timing, bringing its own emergent qualities and agenda. Ridley writes, "Your job is to rest within the vast ocean of potency that is long tide, and to continue to yield control of the session to the client's internal forces. You rest in what is happening exactly as you are, and you do not expect or desire that anything should be different from how it is." Now, this is advice he gives to practitioners. It was advice I received when I started doing my work, and it is something that I live by. But I think this quotation also gives us a hint of where we are going, how to behave in this field. How do we take a paradigm and translate it into a manual, right? What does it compel us to do, this thought that we're in this shared broadcast? What does it compel us to do beyond just believe something? I'm going to just put that on the table for now, along with Ridley's tantalizing idea of yielding to the tide, because that's for another season. I want to share with you something now from my novel IKONA. In my novel, again in the show notes, I imagine this lived state of being, this shared field, as being an embodiment of forgiveness, grace, gratitude, and hope. I've written a chapter in my novel called The Bridge. It's chapter 26, and it's actually a novel within the novel written by my fictional novelist, Gutov. So I'll let you discover that for yourself. But this chapter, The Bridge, explores this radical individual resonance in depth in a fictional context. I'll be diving into that more in the final episodes of this season, but for now, I'll have to be that slightly annoying author who quotes the author within her own book. I truly believe you have to read the chapter to understand what I mean. The chapter itself is intended as a transmission. It's aiming to have an effect on your actual experience, moving beyond the cognitive reasoning of the brain and into the resonance of the body in order to communicate what it might look like if we did accept that we live in this glass mind and we have an ethical duty. In this next part, I want to ask this question and cautiously try to answer it. Is there an evolutionary pressure for us to admit to a shared field? And if so, why might it be so vital now? So we've looked at the data, the telepathy tapes, the experiments of Rupert Sheldrake, Linda McTaggart, the biological reality of the blindfolded children who are learning to see without sight. The evidence suggests that the field is our primary habitat, but if this field is real, we have to ask, why did we ever stop experiencing it? And here I'm not going to go into the history of enlightenment from contemplative traditions like Buddhism or Hinduism or the current popularity of Neo-Advaita, and I'm not going to attempt to explain non-dualism and how as a species we have understood and experienced oneness, how it's been lost, how people regain it. Instead, I want to propose something else. I want to propose this, that the private mind has been just simply a protective shell that we grew to survive a materialist worldview. It has allowed us to believe that our actions have no ripples, no consequences, that our hatreds are contained, and that we can flourish while others suffer. But that shell is now suffocating us. I've already referred to the glass mind of a shared field. And I think that the reason this glass mind is emerging today is not just because we need to collaborate globally on policy, it's because we can no longer, as a species, survive the delusion of separation. Our global crises, whether environmental or societal, are simply the physical symptoms of a species that has forgotten it is one organism. When we look at a polluted stream or a fractured society, we are looking at the results of private mind logic. But when the field becomes conscious, when you start to feel the thirst of the person downstream as your own, the very possibility of causing harm begins to dissolve. This is the bridge between the data and our destiny. We are being forced into telepathic transparency because a species that feels the whole cannot destroy the whole. The glass mind concept is the biological corrective to a heart that has felt it is apart and isolated and alone, battling its own lonely battles for far too long. It is the emergence of a literal felt empathy that makes the old destructive ways of being physically impossible to maintain. In this shifting field, transparency is no longer a spiritual luxury. It is a survival requirement. We must become an awakened telepathic species because, quite simply, the isolated human can no longer navigate the world that the isolated human created. Here's my lived, felt experience, having experienced my own awakening in a group of others. In a multidimensional reality, personal awakening is never a private event. When one person dismantles their ego attachments, releasing unforgiveness, anchoring into an embodied experience of oneness, they're not just healing themselves, they're creating a localized zone of coherence in a field of static. Because we are interconnected, that one person's awakening acts as a phase transition for the collective. Just as a single crystal dropped into a saturated solution causes the entire beaker to crystallize, one awakened vessel changes the conductivity of the entire human field. I think we are evolving into the glass mind now because the pressure of the world is finally forcing us to realize that the most powerful thing we can do for the planet is to become a clear, resonant transmission for the whole. In my novel IKONA, I wrote the chapter, The Bridge, as a metaphor for this. Now, what this means for us going forward is the subject of a future episode. But for now, if the telepathy tapes tell us anything, it's that the walls of the private mind were never as solid as we thought. We've realized today that we aren't just isolated observers of reality, we are participants in a shared relational field. We're constantly broadcasting, receiving, and resonating with one another in a way that makes the idea of private thought seem like a relic of the old world. But once we accept that our minds can bridge space, we have to face an even more staggering truth. That the field doesn't just span across the world, it flows through time. If you aren't an island in space, you certainly aren't a closed loop in time. In our next episode, episode 4, The Lineage of Light, Ancestral and Incarnational Resonance, we move into the 4th threshold. We're going to look at why your personal anxiety or your unexplained grief or your sudden flashes of a life you've never lived might not belong to you at all. We're going to move beyond the idea of family history as a collection of names and dates and see it for what it truly is. Ancestral resonance that is currently vibrating in your cells. We'll explore the discovery that when you heal a thought form or a trauma from 3 generations ago, you might literally be altering the frequency of your current field. Whose memories are you actually carrying? And more importantly, what happens when you finally learn how to clear what isn't yours to carry? We'll meet again soon at the edges of the known. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please follow and rate, or even better, review the Shattering Place podcast. And if you also enjoyed my novel IKONA, please consider joining my free membership community at ikonathecommunity.com. All information is in the show notes. In the community, you can access periodic group calls, some of my reflections and unpublished writing, and more to come. Just a quick word about working with me one-on-one. My local clinic remains my sanctuary for traditional grounded healing. That work is at capacity, however. In any case, it's committed to stabilization and baseline care. But for those of you who are ready to move beyond baseline into your true evolutionary mission, I'm opening a new door, the 90-day structural recalibration. This immersive partnership sits outside the clinical model, allowing me to bring my full multidimensional toolkit to your process. If you are ready to go further, details are in the show notes. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll meet again soon.